Happy New Year to all, including to my many enemies, and those who have fought me and lost so badly, they just don't know what to do. Love.
I am Ryan McKnight.
I'm Cara Santa Maria.
I am Christopher Smith.
Hi, I'm Andrew Torres.
This is Naked Mormonism,
the serial Mormon history podcast. Bennett wrecked it all. May of 1842 wasn't the first time that Bennett had shown some signs that he may not be the most upright kind of guy. Now, let's be real for just a minute here. If Joe gravitated towards John C. Bennett so much because of similar personalities, Joe must have known at a subconscious level the possibilities that Bennett shared some of his flaws, even if Joe never consciously acknowledged any of his own character flaws. Possibly as a result of this realization, possibly due to Bennett overstepping his boundaries in one way or another, Joe sent his trusted friend George Miller to investigate Bennett's history in Ohio, where he was located prior to moving to Illinois and attaining the office of Quartermaster General of the Illinois Militia. George Miller's report wasn't good. More than a year before Bennett and Joe had their falling out, Miller reported that Bennett, a claimed bachelor, had a living wife with children. This is from 1841. Quote, "His poor but confiding wife followed him from place to place, with no suspicion of his unfaithfulness to her. At length, however, he became so bold in his departures that it was evident to all around that he was a sore offender, and his wife left him under satisfactory evidence of his adulterous connections." End quote. Subsequent historians, in an effort to paint him as an even more immoral bastard than he was, have postulated that he was removed from the Ohio Masonic Society for unruly conduct, although those claims are a bit disputed at this point. Regardless, Bennett had a complicated past, and it seems that Joe became privy to some of that information as he learned more of Bennett's practices. A mere 3 months after Joe had sent Miller to Ohio to scout out information on Bennett, Bennett had propositioned a young woman named Catherine Fuller. Her testimony, collected in late May 1842, when church leaders were collecting as much dirt on Bennett as they could, reveals how quick Bennett was in his methods of propositioning a woman for intimacy. From Catherine Fuller, quote, "Nearly a year ago, I became acquainted with John C. Bennett, after visiting twice, and on the third time he proposed unlawful intercourse, being about 1 week after first acquaintance. He said he wished his desires granted. I told him it was contrary to my feelings. He assured me there was others in higher standing than I was who would conduct in that way, and there was no harm in it. He said there should be no sin upon me. If there was any sin, it should come upon himself. Bennett was the first man that seduced me. No man ever made the attempt before him." End quote. I want to tease apart some of the language in her testimony, as it will provide a little bit of context for the rest of the documentation that we're reading today. First off, Fuller became acquainted with Bennett, and about a week later, he approached her with his proposal. Then, when Catherine rejected him, saying it was contrary to her feelings, he told her that other higher-ups in Mormonism were practicing polygamy. The way that it's worded specifically alludes to husbands and wives conducting themselves in the practice of polygamy, not just the men who were taking multiple wives. She also added that Bennett said there was no harm in it, and if there was any sin in it, he would take that sin upon himself. That's exactly the same sales pitch that Joe and his mothers in Israel used to seduce other women, and those same claims appear with stunning ubiquity when it comes to Joe's polygamous relationships. Finally, Catherine concludes with claiming that Bennett was the first man that seduced her and that no man had ever done so before. The language she used leaves plenty of loopholes, namely that it sounds legalistic, and as if it only needed to be mentioned if there were allegations to the contrary, right? Beyond that, it says nothing of the men who had propositioned her after Bennett had done so. You see, sexual predators like Bennett and Joe can recognize similar characteristics that make easy marks. Catherine may have been a young woman who exhibited those characteristics. Remember Clarissa Marvel from last week? An orphan without any friends? Loneliness is one of the primary markers that predators can easily pick up on. That's merely one of myriad markers, and it may very well be the case that Catherine Fuller was propositioned by more Mormon elite after Bennett had done so, because she may have exhibited some of these characteristics. What's even more likely, and this happens more than I like to admit, I'm probably just reading too much between the lines, so let that be a disclaimer as we continue to read through what the history of the church has to say about Bennett and some of the other things we're reading today. The reason I'm relying heavily on reading between the lines is because how everything was recorded as the issue played out. Immediately, it becomes clear that Joe was in full damage control mode, trying to minimize the impact of Bennett's very public and vitriolic departure from the church. There exist discrepancies in what testimonials were collected to smear Bennett and what his own methods reveal in propositioning women in Nauvoo. He was using the same language as Joe was using to acquire prospective wives, but the public statements and affidavits were used to distance anything Joe may have been doing from what Bennett was now rumored to be doing. There wasn't a difference in method, okay? Just a difference in how brazen and frequent such propositions were being made by Bennett as opposed to Joseph Smith. So let's begin dissecting the statements and see what can be gleaned here. Bennett had supporters. As soon as he, quote-unquote, resigned from the office of mayor in Nauvoo, Joe gave a revelation, which was never published in the Doctrine and Covenants, which says, quote, "Verily thus saith the Lord unto you, my servant, by the voice of my spirit, Hiram Kimball has been insinuating evil and forming evil opinions against you with others. And if he continue in them, he and they shall be accursed. For I am the Lord thy God, and will stand by thee and bless thee. Amen." End quote. And the way that Joe delivers the revelation, of course, is fantastic. He says, quote, "Which I threw across the room to Hiram Kimball, one of the counselors." I will say, Hiram Kimball was a Jack Mormon. He wasn't a member. "After the election, I spoke at some length concerning the evil reports which were abroad in the city concerning myself, and the necessity of counteracting the designs of our enemies, establishing a night watch, and control the same." End quote. Establishing a night watch. Armed guards just patrolling Nauvoo at night. Hiram Kimball, John C. Bennett, there's a small contingency of other elders and high-ranking members of the church and city government. They were not pleased with the revelations coming to light that Joe was dishonest in his approach here. He was practicing polygamy, as Bennett had been, yet in public refused to admit it, instead choosing to make Bennett the sacrificial lamb for Nauvoo's adulterous rumors. The way the rest of this council meeting is recorded in the history of the church is something to behold. We need to understand that Bennett's departure was explosive, and it created a complete meltdown of the regularly controlled propaganda outlets of the church. Probably after withstanding a fair amount of abuse from the elders for quite some time, Bennett stood up in this high council meeting and made a statement. And hopefully you'll be able to recognize that this statement is likely almost completely fabricated, based on the language alone. Given the invocation of the name Samson of Vard in the middle of the statement, we can infer the contents of the discussion prior to Bennett making the statement, which we'll discuss after reading it. Quote, "I know what I am about, and the heads of the church know what they are about, I expect. I have no difficulty with the heads of the church. I publicly avow that anyone who has said that I have stated that General Joseph Smith has given me authority to hold illicit intercourse with women is a liar in the face of God. Those who have said it are damned liars. They are infernal liars. He never, either in public or private, gave me any such authority or license, and any person who states it is a scoundrel and a liar. I have heard it said that I should become a second Samson of Vard by withdrawing from the church, and that I was at variance with the heads, and should use an influence against them because I resigned the office of mayor. This is false. I have no difficulty with the heads of the church, and I intend to continue with you, and hope the time may come when I may be restored to full confidence, fellowship, and my former standing in the church, and that my conduct may be such as to warrant my restoration. And should the time ever come that I may have the opportunity to test my faith, It will then be known whether I am a traitor or a true man." End quote. Do any of you remember who Dr. Samson Avard was in our timeline? We'll have to go back to episodes 49 and 50 to hear about Thomas B. Marsh and Dr. Samson Avard defecting from the leadership during the height of the Mormon War in Missouri of 1838. It was because of their affidavits, Thomas B. Marsh and Samson Avard, that the government was able to prove that the Danites existed and that Joe controlled a rogue militia who had offensively attacked Missouri militiamen. Samson Avard's testimony was crucial in getting Joe and the other 5 Mormon elites locked up in Liberty Jail awaiting a jury trial for arson, robbery, and high treason. Dr. Samson Avard was a paramount defector. To know that they were drawing equivocation between Samson Avard and John C. Bennett is very illustrative of what may have actually been said in this High Council meeting, deciding what to do with Bennett as he slowly slipped into the role of scapegoat of this community. Bennett's statement garnered a bit of a response from Joseph Smith. Quote, "Will you please state definitely whether you know anything against my character, either in public or private?" General Bennett replied, "I do not. In all my intercourse with General Smith, in public and in private, he has been strictly virtuous." End quote. Now, this is just such a complex set of circumstances to try and sift through here, but Bennett has been so maligned and written over in Mormon history that we can't know what these exchanges actually looked like. We can be certain the way that it's reported in the history of the church from where I've been reading this is nothing like what actually happened. Okay, the history of the church is very effective at writing Mormon history in a way that is favorable to Joe, and Bennett revealed a lot of unfavorable characteristics in Joe's conduct. Thus, we can't trust any of what's written here as historically factual. We can only read it and then make tentative assumptions based on the historical context from which this history was initially recorded. So Joe responded to Bennett, supposedly saying that he had been nothing but virtuous. Quote, "I then made some pertinent remarks before the council concerning those who had been guilty of circulating false reports, etc., and said, 'Let 1 12-month see if Brother Joseph is not called for to go to every part of the city to keep them out of their groves. And I turn the keys upon them from this hour. If they will not repent and stop their lyings and surmisings, let God curse them, and let their tongues cleave to the roofs of their mouths.'" End quote. It's awfully defensive language for a council meeting where Bennett had done nothing but say that Joe was the nicest and most purest of all the prophets in the world, huh? I mean, this was during the same council where Joe was unanimously elected mayor in place of Bennett once Bennett had resigned. Further, after all of these remarks, Joe made another power grab. Joe's unpredictable wild card brother, Crazy Willie, enjoyed a nice little appointment. Quote, "William Smith was elected councilor in place of Joseph Smith, elected mayor. George A. Smith, counselor in place of Hugh McFall, removed from the city." End quote. This guy, Hugh McFall, there is basically nothing that I can find about this guy, much less what precipitated his swift removal from the city. And, George A. Smith replacing him. And now, I don't think I'd be venturing too far out on this proverbial limb of historical speculation to say that Hugh McFall was likely removed in connection with what was happening with Bennett and the whole spiritual wifery business. But why I say that is just consider what happened here. Bennett resigned from mayor, and Joe was immediately elected to his position. Joe's older brother, Hiram Sidekick Abiff, was appointed to vice mayor. His younger brother, Crazy Willie, was put in Joe's vacant place as counselor to the mayor, and Joe's cousin, George A. Smith, was appointed as another counselor in the place of the mysteriously disappeared Hugh McFall. Of the more than 20 elected positions of Nauvoo government, Joe, his brothers, and his cousin now enjoyed all of the highest positions and decision-making authority. So, dissenters were removed, and those who toe the party line keep their positions. Those who were most favored by the prophet because they not only towed the party line, but helped expand the power and reach of the prophet, they were promoted to higher and higher positions within the church and the city government. Nauvoo was fast becoming an autocracy run by the Smith family. Now, please keep in mind that this is happening at the exact same time that Pistol Pack and Porter Rockwell was in Missouri and attempted to assassinate ex-Governor Lilburn Boggs. Boggs was the single greatest enemy of the church at the time, and the rhetoric crafted to vilify Governor Boggs is extreme, to say the least, when it comes to the Missouri era. But at this time, Lilburn Boggs didn't hold any real political power. That assassination attempt was fueled more by cold-blooded vengeance. But it did have some political ramifications. And why I say that is because Boggs was running for Missouri State Senate, which would have been a royal pain for Joe if he was to keep his high standing with Illinois politicians, Illinois and Missouri being neighbors. And it wasn't just Bennett who was a serious offender that was requiring cleansing from this town, okay? There was a lot happening at this time, and Bennett revealed a lot of fractures in the foundation that were just being realized by the leadership. This is from the History of the Church on May 24th, quote, Chauncey L. Higbee was cut off from the church by the High Council for unchaste and unvirtuous conduct towards certain females, and for teaching that it was right if kept secret. Oh, interesting. The same exact language that Bennett and Joseph were using. He was also put under $200 bonds to keep the peace on my complaint against him for slander before Ebenezer Robinson, Justice of the Peace. Chauncey L. Higbee was, quote-unquote, slandering the prophet and was excommunicated from the church because of unvirtuous conduct towards certain females and saying that it was right if it was kept secret. Just like Catherine Fuller said about John C. Bennett, just like a number of women said about Joseph Smith, just like Martha Brotherton said about Brigham Young. There's a pattern here, people. This is crazy because their trusted Mormon elites who'd been there from the earliest days were dropping like flies. Now, Higbee here, he must have been in league with Bennett at some level in order to merit punishment and disfellowshipping the day before Bennett was formally excommunicated. Apparently, the meetings during these following days were even more hostile to Bennett when we read the next passages. Quote, Notice was this day given to John C. Bennett that the First Presidency, 12 and bishops had withdrawn fellowship from him, and were about to publish it in the paper, but on his humbling himself and begging we would spare him from the paper for his mother's sake, the notice was withdrawn from the paper on the 26th of May. This forenoon I attended a meeting of near 100 of the brethren in the lodge room, to whom John C. Bennett acknowledged his wicked and licentious conduct towards certain females in Nauvoo, and that he was worthy of the severest chastisements. Yeah, he was asking them to punish him, of course he was. And cried like a child, and begged that he might be spared in any possible way. So deep was his apparent sense of guilt and unfitness for respectable society, so deeply did he feign, or really feel contrition for the moment, that he was forgiven still. I pled for mercy for him. End quote. Oh yes, how merciful of Joseph Smith to plead mercy for Bennett, when he was at the mercy of the brethren who were threatening him with complete defamation, given his political and religious status and the severity of these accusations. But Joe wasn't done. That same afternoon, the High Council meeting was in the morning of the Masonic Lodge. Now the afternoon comes along, and he met in the public square near Talos' Temple Crown to make some public declarations, with hundreds of Mormons in attendance. I'm driving towards a point here. Now just hang in there with me for a bit as we continue to track Joe through May of 1842. We'll get to my central point here near the end of the lecture. Quote, At 1 p.m., I attended a large and respectable meeting of the citizens of Nauvoo near the temple, and addressed them on the principles of government at considerable length, showing that I did not intend to vote the Whig or Democrat ticket as such, but would go for those who would support good order, etc. End quote. Let's put this in context. 1842 was an important election year for the Mormons in Illinois. For politicians seeking a solid voting bloc in an important area, they needed the Mormons' support, which was gained by trading favors to Joe Smith for their votes. Joe said it himself. He, meaning the Mormons, of course, would go for those who would support good order, which is veiled language. That translates to whoever scratches our back the best. They get the Mormon bloc vote. The Warsaw Signal saw how crucial this election year of 1842 was, where Hancock County, where Nauvoo was, stood to get a new governor to replace Thomas Carlin, and Carlin had been famously friendly to the Mormons. It was under Carlin's watch that the Mormons were able to gain asylum in Illinois in the wake of the Missouri-Mormon War. Here's what the Warsaw Signal reported in January of 1842, and it reprinted an interesting article out of the Sangamo Journal, and the Sangamo Journal will become very important in the coming weeks of our historical timeline. Quote, Joe Smith's proclamation. As we expected, the wonderful document issued by the prophet directing his followers how to vote has created great shaking amongst the dry bones of the politicians. On one hand, the Whigs say it is a high-handed and insolent production, and on the other, the Democrats say humph, scarcely knowing whether to approve or condemn. We are not prophets, but we will hazard the prediction, who tampers with the Mormons or condescends to sycophancy in order to ensure their support will, in less than 5 years, lose more by the withdrawal of the confidence of the people than it is now in the power of the Mormons to give. That's a powerful statement. But still, notwithstanding this is apparent, such is the devotion with which men kneel, that there are those who are willing to worship a money-digger as a god, if they can secure their political vote. The Sangamo Journal, heretofore a friend of the Mormons, had its tune wonderfully changed by the proclamation. Hear him. This is where it's quoting the Sangamo Journal. The proclamation which follows this preface is in itself most strange and daring, perversive of the privileges of a citizen. It would not be so were the signer anyone else than the person whom it represents, Joseph Smith. Mr. Smith is supposed by his followers to be a prophet of the Most High God. Whether he is or not is no matter of dispute at present. But as such prophet, he is held in the highest veneration and respect by his followers, whom he leads easily by the belief of his high calling. Now, as long as Mr. Smith keeps near the sanctuary and prophecies of religion, he is guileless of offense. But when he enters upon the duties of a civil office of the state, and as a lieutenant general speaks to his friends, whom, as a prophet, he can command, and uses the religious influence he possesses under the military garb he has acquired, he becomes a dangerous man, and must look to the consequences. If he would take a friendly advice, we would say, let some Joshua, the son of Nun, lead the armies, and let him stick to interpretation and prophecy. And for we do assure him upon an honest belief that his situation in Illinois is far more dangerous than it ever was in Missouri. If he undertakes to take Muhammad's part, his only prototype, save Makuana, and play the warrior and patriot, or prophet, as for the supreme judge who is so all-powerful with the sect, let him look to it that ambition does not overlap its mark. End quote. Hearing of Joe's declaration that they would only vote for those who would support good order, and that's in the Mormon sense, of course, that must have left the anti-Mormon party fuming, especially in the wake of so many revelations coming from Nauvoo of sexual impropriety with Bennett's very public excommunication and removal from the office of mayor and major general of the Nauvoo Legion. So, the Warsaw Signal saying, the Sangamo Journal, heretofore a friend of the Mormons, has had its tune wonderfully changed by the proclamation. It really captures the entire sentiment of the way that people viewed Joseph Smith and his ever-increasing power. Amidst this chaos ensuing, so many other factors continue to play in which only made issues more complex. For example, here's just something, this is an article published in the Lamoille Standard, I guess. I don't know how to say that, out of Vermont. This is in January of 1842, right around the same time that previous article was published in the Warsaw Signal. Quote, Joe Smith's new peeping stone. We learn from the most indisputable authority that Joe has found a new peeping stone. The circumstances of this discovery are rather curious, and we give them as received. He was walking about some evenings ago with a lady, or a woman, whichever you please, when suddenly he darted aside and leapt into a cellar. When he presently cried out, How come I here? How shall I get out? The lady with this seized him and raised him as though he had been a child. Joe then stated the miraculous manner of his being drawn by the power of God into the cellar and to the very spot where laid the stone, which he says has the remarkable property of enabling him to translate unknown language and discover the place where treasures are hidden. Look out for miracles soon. Joe no doubt intends to find lots of money before long that for months have been lying by him. That was, of course, a reprint of a Warsaw Signal article. End quote. That stone must have worked, because the Book of Abraham was published a mere 2 months later. The Nauvoo Masonic Lodge was established the same month of March of 1842, and hundreds of Mormons were now filling the ranks of Freemasons in the state of Illinois to an inordinate proportion, so much so that the other Illinois Freemasons were starting to take notice and not like what the Mormons were doing in Nauvoo. The temple ceremony was created while Pistol Packin' Porter was in Missouri killing Lilburn Boggs during his senatorial campaign. A military parade and sham battle took place in which Joe thought that his life may have been threatened by Bennett, who was trying to orchestrate a convenient little accident during the drill. But the power and might of the Nauvoo Legion was nonetheless paraded through Nauvoo for all to see. Once again, as it had happened so many times before, and it would happen many times again, Mormon and non-Mormon alike were there to witness the spectacle. Also, the endowment ceremony was introduced in early May of 1842, where men would go into closed doors to the upper floor of the red brick store or the recently built and dedicated Masonic Lodge, and they'd perform these clandestine rites and rituals that were sworn to secrecy by threat of death by throat slitting and disembowelment. Added to everything, Joe was hopelessly in debt and didn't seem to have much of a care for how money worked in the real world. He had signed contracts with insane interest rates and horrendous terms on viciously inflated land prices due to all the speculation. He'd opened the red brick store and he was working as a clerk some of his days, while Bishop Newell K. Whitney worked in the office in back to reconcile ledgers and collect tithing and other donations from members to help fund the public works projects like the temple, the canal through town, the Nauvoo House Organization, all of these organizations that were established in D&C 124. And amidst all of the public affairs happening in Nauvoo, the Smith home itself experienced a tragedy on the part of Emma's family. Now, Emma Hale, let's slow down for a second, had been dragged from state to state as the elect lady of the prophet. When she departed Harmony, Pennsylvania for New York in 1830, she said goodbye to her parents for the last time. She never saw them again before they died. Her father, Isaac, died in January of 1839. Her mother 3 years later. This is from Mormon Enigma, page 102. Quote, Emma's father had died January 11, 1839. His tombstone bore the inscription, "The body of Isaac Hale, the hunter." Like the cover of an old book, its contents torn out and stripped of their lettering and gilding, lies here, food for worms. Yet the work itself shall not be lost, and it will appear once more in a new and beautiful edition, corrected and amended. Isaac's will left the farm to his son Alva, with the stipulation that he maintain his mother, quote, in a kind and comfortable and proper manner during her life. Elizabeth Hale died 3 years later, on February 16, 1842. Isaac Hale's will stipulated that, after paying each brother $20, Alva was also to, quote, pay his sisters such sums as would be right and proper, end quote. Emma seems to be included without discrimination on Isaac's part. Throughout these months of sorrow, Emma also took on additional responsibilities. She and Joseph had particular interest in 3 of the building projects in Nauvoo. The temple was planned for the spiritual rejuvenation of the saints. The anticipated Nauvoo House Hotel, across the street to the east from the old homestead, would help provide income and accommodations for visitors, and Joseph's red brick store, which would be the setting for many events in Emma's life, neared completion at the end of 1841. In the middle of December, Emma and Joseph unpacked 13 wagon loads of goods. The shelves bulged with a wide variety of items that tempted the frugal citizens. Most of the supplies had been ordered by Joseph's representatives on the East Coast and sent to the shipping head at St. Louis. Emma had power of attorney. Joseph wrote Edward Hunter in Pennsylvania, quote, your message is delivered to Mrs. Smith, and she will be glad to have returns on her letter of attorney as speedily as circumstances will permit, according to the understanding thereof. P.S. You will endeavor to have the money on your letter of attorney from Mrs. Smith ready to furnish a supply of goods in early spring. End quote. One wonders if the death of Emma's parents and some of her resulting inheritance was used to purchase goods for the red brick store. It's not a crazy thought, really. The finances in Nauvoo were such a muddled and chaotic mess that it would be hard to pin that down for sure. But, it's speculation. Take that for what it's worth. But what was great about the red brick store is it was a way to temporarily satisfy creditors. With supplies and commodities so scarce and of extremely high value in Nauvoo, the red brick store had a huge chunk of capital in the form of the goods that they stocked that the people wanted. So when a creditor would come in and press Joseph Smith for some money that the creditor was owed, often threatening violence if Joseph didn't pony up, Joe would send the gentleman on his way with a bushel of corn or a barrel of molasses from the store's inventory. Now, this may have satisfied the creditor momentarily, but it didn't get rid of the debts, and it quickly drove the red brick store itself into insolvency. But that's just one of many projects that were going on. The construction projects everywhere throughout Nauvoo were losing funds quickly, and workers weren't making any money, or the money that they made were just stocks in the Nauvoo house project, which wasn't paying anything out yet. So the stocks were worthless. The Mormons construction workers, they couldn't feed their families with the rag money that was being provided. This is from Flanders, Nauvoo Kingdom on the Mississippi, page 186. Quote, "The Nauvoo House Committee was trying apparently to stir up some enthusiasm for the hotel down on the flat, where the pay for laborers was less certain than in house building in the Temple neighborhood up on the hill. Quote, "When I have had a pound of meat or quart of meal," Smith reported, Lucian Woodworth as saying, "I have divided with the workmen. We have had about 300 men on the job, and some of the best men in the world. Those who have not complained I want to continue with me." Meaning those people who don't complain that they aren't getting paid for their labor. That's what that means. "And those that hate Mormonism and everything else that's good, I want them to get their pay and run away as quickly as possible." So pay them. But they never got paid. The Mormons didn't have money to pay those workers. Then Smith took up the subject with a will. "If stores and houses were to be built, it will curse the place." Those are Gentile stores and houses, of course. He chastises those who speculated in buildings on the hill and called attention to unfinished buildings all over town, such as grog shops and card shops and counterfeit shops, etc., got up for speculation while the Nauvoo house is neglected. "The building of the Nauvoo house is just as sacred in my view as the temple. I want the Nauvoo house built. It must be built. Our salvation depends on it." End quote. All of the financial affairs were pressing too heavily on Joe. The leadership of the church, they couldn't handle it. Joe was trustee in trust of the church as well as president. However, as was the case in Curlin and Missouri, Joe hadn't ever incorporated the church. Everything he did was all in his own name, which opened him up to every legal vulnerability thinkable. He was honestly terrible with financial affairs. This all came to a head in April of 1842, when the Quorum of the 12, working under the direction of Joe, instated a desperate program in hopes of fixing the cloud of debt hanging over Nauvoo. Want to know what that desperate program is? Yeah, forgiveness. Once again from Flanders, page 167, quote, "On April 12, 1842, the Quorum of 12 initiated a program of debt forgiveness within the church. Many saints had borrowed from their brethren over a period of years, and the presidency and bishopric had done likewise to relieve the destitute from the Missouri expulsion to build up Nauvoo." Quoting the apostles, "Many of these claims have already been settled. Many have been given up as canceled by those who held them, and many remain unsettled. Now the 12 urged a general cancellation of all such claims, which have arisen out of the difficulties and calamities of the church, that when the temple is completed, there will be nothing from this source to produce jars and discords, strifes and animosities, so as to prevent the blessings of heaven descending upon us as a people. While things remain as they are, and men remain subject to the temptations of evil as they now are, the day of release and year of jubilee cannot be. How are the saints to prosper when the church, the presidency, the bishops, and, quote, those who had sacrificed everything but life for our salvation are thus encumbered? It cannot be," end quote. They advised that all such old accounts, notes, bonds, etc. be consecrated to the temple. If they could be negotiated, the proceeds would advance the building. If not, after the temple was finished, quote, "We will make a burnt offering of them, which shall bind the brethren together in the bonds of eternal peace and love and union, and you shall rejoice that you have hearkened unto counsel and set our brethren free." End quote. Yep, a debt forgiveness program, where the notes will be gathered into the temple upon completion and be offered as a burnt sacrifice to set the brethren free. That wasn't the only measure taken in 1842 to absolve debts, because the Federal Bankruptcy Act was passed in August of 1841 and went into effect February of 1842. It couldn't come soon enough. When Joe learned of the possibility that bankruptcy would absolve him of debts, or at least abate them for a brief period, he jumped at the opportunity. Quote, "Joseph Smith and his brothers Hiram and Samuel declared themselves insolvent before the County Commissioner's Court on April 18, 1842, and filed petitions to be certified bankrupt by the United States District Court for Illinois. Concurrently, other leading Mormons filed similar petitions, including President Sidney Rigdon, Bishop Vincent Knight, Judge Elias Higbee, Reynolds Cahoon, Henry G. Sherwood, John P. Green, Arthur Morrison, George Morey, Jared Carter, Amos Davis, Charles Warner, William P. Lyon, William Niswanger, and John Fulmer. They were joined by at least one prominent Gentile businessman of Nauvoo, Hiram Kimball. That guy who was, chased out earlier. The Federal Bankruptcy Act provided that an inventory of assets and creditors be provided the court, which then decided whether to grant a decree and certificate of bankruptcy. Household and personal effects to a value of $300 were exempt. Smith chose to ignore the provision of the law that no trustee in trust was eligible for bankruptcy. After Smith initiated bankruptcy proceedings, he recorded few additional details of the matter. David Kilbourne, an unfriendly neighbor of the Saints in Montrose, claimed that the commissioner of bankruptcy for Hancock County, a Mr. Catlin, told him that Joseph and Hiram Smith included $70,000 to $80,000 worth of Gallen's worthless half-breed land script in their inventory of assets. John C. Bennett, who in May 1842 broke with the church, included in his spectacular attack on Smith the charge that the prophet was attempting to use the bankruptcy law to perpetrate a huge swindle of his creditors. Bennett claimed that when Smith was in Carthage in April to begin his bankruptcy proceedings, he recorded in the county deed book the transfer of a block of Nauvoo property from Smith to the trustee in trust, dated October 5, 1841. The date, said Bennett, was fictitious. No transfer was made until Smith decided to undertake bankruptcy. End quote. Now, that was a little confusing, but suffice it to say, Joe must have known there would be holdups in his bankruptcy filings because he cooked the books a little bit to transfer property out of his name before the filing went through. So what he did is he transferred nearly 300 high-priced Nauvoo acres out of his and Emma's name to the office of Joseph Smith as trustee in trust, showing his assets were lower than what they really were on the books. Now, as a result, in Flanders, Nauvoo Kingdom on the Mississippi, that's what he says, quote, "The declaration of insolvency was quick and easily made, but obtaining a court decree was, in Smith's case at least, a protracted and ultimately futile affair. It is probable that the prophet's private affairs and corporate obligations were too badly mixed for the court to untangle." End quote. So here in spring into early summer 1842, chaos abounds. With his bankruptcy proceedings going through the court, which would take more than 7 months before he heard back concerning the outcome, all of these events culminate in nothing but chaos and pandemonium. Beyond it all, the Bennett issue was only waxing messy. The May 26, 1842 meeting of Relief Society is absolutely insane. They inducted nearly 200 new members, which was the largest growth since the society was organized a mere 2 months prior. It was standing room only in the Masonic Lodge room where they were convened. It opened up, and the president, Emma, was late. Numerous affidavits have been collected in order to begin the smear campaign against Bennett's character, and Bennett and spiritual wifery was the buzz of Nauvoo. I mean, it impacted the women. They're all gathering together. We're going to talk about it, okay? Everything we've discussed not relating to Bennett thus far was just the underlying tension. Bennett and spiritual wifery were the most prominent subjects on everybody's mind at this time. Mother Elizabeth Ann Whitney, Joe and Emma's first close friend in Kirtland upon their arrival back in 1831, with whom they had lived with them multiple times for differing periods of time, stood up and filled the empty time as Emma was arriving late by, she just started thanking the group and acknowledging the new members. But then Emma and Joseph entered the room together. Now, who knows what the subject of their conversation was prior to entering the room? If only to be a fly on the wall, right? Now, Emma didn't start off by addressing the Relief Society. Instead, Joe took the stand and started by reading Ezekiel 14. Knowing the context of Bennett and the furious questions raging in people's minds about how pious Joseph really is, Ezekiel 14 takes on a very interesting context. This is beginning with verse 6, quote, "Therefore say unto the house of Israel, Thus saith the Lord God, Repent and turn yourselves from your idols, and turn away from your faces from all your abominations. For every one of the house of Israel, or of the stranger that sojourneth in Israel, which separateth himself from me, and setteth up his idols in his heart, and putteth the stumbling block of his iniquity before his face, and cometh to a prophet to inquire of him concerning me, I, the Lord, will answer him by myself, and I will set my face against that man, and will make him a sign and a proverb, and I will cut him off from the midst of my people. And ye shall know that I am the Lord. And if the prophet be deceived when he hath spoken a thing, I, the Lord, have deceived that prophet, and I will stretch out my hand upon him, and will destroy him from the midst of my people in Israel." End quote. That is the beginning of Joseph's sermon to the women in the Relief Society amidst the John C. Bennett scandal. That's the scriptural citation he uses. If God leads the prophet astray, God will kill the prophet before he leads the saints astray. But Joe is still alive, so he must be the true prophet, right? That was his way of abating concerns that he had fallen into apostasy or was a false prophet. But then the sermon takes a dark turn from there. This is reading from Mormon Enigma, quote, "There is another error which opens a door for the adversary to enter. As females possess refined feelings and sensitivities, they are also subject to an overmuch zeal, which must ever prove dangerous and cause them to be rigid in a religious capacity." Just take that stick out. Just relax a little bit. "You should be armed with mercy, notwithstanding the iniquity among us. Put a double watch over the tongue. You should chasten and reprove and keep it all in silence, not even mention them again." And after telling the women to hold their tongues and ignore those that are cast out for their own iniquity, Joseph turned directly to Emma and said this, "Search yourselves. The tongue is an unruly member. Hold your tongues about things of no moment. A little tale will set the world on fire. At this time, the truth on the guilty should not be told openly. Strange as this may seem, yet this is policy. We must use precaution in bringing sinners to justice, lest in exposing these heinous sins we draw the indignation of a Gentile world upon us, and to their imagination justly too. It is necessary to hold an influence in the world and thus spare ourselves an extermination." End quote. Hold your tongues, women, or we'll suffer extermination again. Stop the rumors, or Illinois will treat us as Missouri did. You women want to be responsible for that? It's insane. The meeting concluded after Joe's threats and convened the next day in the grove near the temple where 600 plus women would be able to attend. This time, Father Newell K. Whitney, who had been taught the doctrine of polygamy, was allowing Joe to court his 17-year-old daughter, Sarah Ann Whitney, who Joe would marry in July of 1842. That's a month and a half after this meeting. That same Newell K. Whitney took the pulpit and gave an extremely odd speech. Here it is. Quote, "In the beginning, God created man, male and female, and bestowed upon man certain blessings peculiar to a man of God, of which women partook, so that without the female, all things cannot be restored to the earth. It takes all to restore the priesthood. God has many precious things to bestow, even to our astonishment, if we are faithful. I say again, rejoice in the prospect of what lays before. If we are striving to do right, although we may err in judgment many times, yet we are justified in the sight of God if we do the best we can." That is Joseph Smith's exact language when propositioning women. "It is our privilege to stand in an attitude to get testimony for ourselves." Just go and pray about it, Helen Mar Kimball. Go and pray about it, and an angel with a sword will show you the light. "It is as much our privilege as that of ancient saints. If we understand all things, we shall not be barren or unfruitful in the knowledge of God. Far be it from me to harbor iniquity and outbreaking sins. We may have different views of things. Still, there is some criterion which all may come to, and by bringing our minds and wills into subjection to the law of the Lord, may come to unity. I tell you, there are blessings before to be conferred as soon as our hearts are prepared to receive them." End quote. This speech must have been one of those talks where the people in attendance heard two different talks. There were those who were not privy to the teachings of polygamy or celestial marriage, spiritual wifery, whatever you want to call it. It's the same thing. Who probably were now enticed that something will be revealed in the future if our hearts are prepared to receive it. But they can be sure that anything that's taught or practiced is the will of God, even though some will occasionally err in judgment. Besides, Joseph gave an amazing sermon yesterday from Ezekiel 14 saying that if God's prophet is led astray, then God will strike him away. So there's no possible way that Joseph is led astray because he's still alive. But then there were also those in attendance who currently had plural relationships with Joe and other Mormon elites. They probably heard a completely different version of that talk, where Whitney was claiming that what they were doing, even though it must remain secretive, is approved of by God and his prophet on earth. According to Newell and Avery in Mormon Enigma, quote, "Undoubtedly, the speech diffused some of the consternation caused by Emma's emphasis on virtue by assuring those women who had accepted the principle of plurality of wives that it was yet taught, supported, and considered a commandment by the leaders of the church, and it presaged the coming endowment." End quote. Outrage, attrition. What we've discussed today alone covers only the first few months of 1842. Excising Bennett and other dissenters from religious and government authority and then putting trusted family members in the resulting vacancies while whitewashing the true motivations for doing so. The assassination of a high-ranking government official during his senatorial campaign by one of the highest-ranking Danites in Nauvoo. Political maneuvering in an election year where the Mormons would gain a new governor in Illinois. New scripture, possibly resulting from a brand new seer stone, which came to be the Book of Abraham. A super-secretive group of men known as the Quorum of Anointed who swore death oaths of secrecy. Yet another military parade and sham battle to exhibit the strength and force of the Nauvoo Legion for anyone who cared to attend. The red brick store being used as Joe's personal piggy bank when the shelves were filled with goods supplied solely by Father Newell K. Whitney, possibly a little bit from Emma's inheritance because her last remaining parent had just passed away. Speculation concerning the temple and the Nauvoo House Hotel organization. Bankruptcy proceedings pushing their way through the state court system to hopefully relieve Joe of his well over $100,000 in personal debt that he was continually defaulting on and accruing more of. And now, all the polygamy rumors boiling over, partly as a result of Bennett's public excommunication and removal from office of mayor, and then Joe telling the women in Nauvoo to hold their tongues or their gossip will bring the ruin of Nauvoo like it happened in Missouri. They'd be exterminated again. How did Joseph find time to sleep? Everything we've discussed is outrageous to some extent for differing reasons, and the saints, friendly and foe alike, were outraged just as much as the Gentiles outside of Nauvoo were outraged, albeit outraged for different reasons about different subjects. The issue at hand here is, this is the point that I talked about earlier, we're all people. The Mormons were all people. Joe was just a dude. Emma was just a dudette. All people have limits, right? Joe and Emma had a limited number of hours in the day and finite wells of energy from which to draw in order to deal with everything happening in Nauvoo. The Mormons had a finite amount of outrage they could feel at each outrageous thing coming to light. The outside world had a finite amount of attention that they could devote to Joe and his wacky fanatical sect, which allowed him and the Mormon leadership to get away with murder unchecked. This outrage attrition cuts every way, though. Joe could only do so much in a given period of time, and people who didn't like what he was doing only had a limited amount of time to answer the next outrage coming out of the Nauvoo mafia family before it all disappeared from collective memory and the next outrage du jour was everybody's focus. Bennett was simply the newest and hottest outrage, and people were madder than hell. But Joe was also wearing them down. He had been for over a decade by this point, with everything he put the Mormons through. It's how people like Joseph Smith operate. It's an algorithm. It's a personality type. It's a war of attrition, and the war is played by constantly doing more insane stuff until people no longer recognize the horrific things done even yesterday because they're too focused on today's outrage. But that model of leadership isn't sustainable. Eventually, people become so exhausted that they don't have any rational answer to stymie the outrage, and then they just take violent action. And, of course, Joe certainly felt their wrath, which happens a mere 2 years from when we currently reside in our timeline. There's no way he has the stamina to keep it up. It makes me wonder, though, what would Joe's Twitter feed look like? That's going to do it for today. We have a couple of new patron supporters over at patreon.com/nakedmormonism. Looks like we have Easton, John, Tom, and I can't believe I'm saying this, a new Namo demon, Kevin Thomas. Tons of new supporters this week. Thank you all so very much. And as a way of saying thank you for supporting the show by a pledge at patreon.com/nakedmormonism, as little as $1 an episode, my way of saying thank you is by providing you with a bunch of extra content. So listeners who do support on Patreon, this last week we had our Namo Home Evening. That's our monthly Google Hangout. It was a full house. We had people who were trying to get into the Google Hangout and couldn't, but it was a really fun conversation with Mr. Atheist. You can check the show notes for this show, or you can go over to the Naked Mormonism YouTube channel, and you can find the Namo Home Evening Hangout for August of 2018. It was a really fun conversation. Also wanted to point out there was the Zelf on the Shelf guest spot. I might have mentioned that last episode. I can't quite remember. But if you haven't seen that yet, go check on Zelf on the Shelf's YouTube channel. And there was a really fun conversation with them between the two fern style type of thing. Also, the Namo Book Club that we host every week that aren't the Namo Hangouts, that's where I read through old Mormon documents, old Mormon books and everything, and add my commentary. It's basically an audiobook version. We're just about to finish with the John Whitmer History of the Church. In fact, next Monday, that's going to be on August 20th, airing that evening, will be the final chapter of the John Whitmer history book. It has been quite a ride to read this original contemporary source of Mormon history. After that, I think we're going to try and tackle the history of the saints. It's going to be a nightmare. But if you want to listen to those Nemo book clubs, which, like I said, they're basically just audiobooks with my commentary of these old original, Mormon books that you don't have to worry about copyright violations because the authors have been dead for more than 100 years. Just search in the Patreon page for Nemo Book Club, Namo Book Club, and you should be able to find all of our previous book clubs that we've done. I think we're moving on to our fourth or fifth one right now. So those are really surprisingly informative if you're looking for the deeper dive into Mormon history of not just hearing what historians are saying, but actually going to the original sources and hearing what the original sources say within their full context of the source itself. So really fun stuff. Also, there's one more recommendation I want to give. This last week on the Glass Box podcast, I know I've mentioned that a little bit prior to this, but it aired on August 14th. That was episode 4. We did a deep dive of Protect Elias Children. Now, Braden and I have been tracking Protect Elias Children in the movement for quite some time, and it's just coming on the tail end of Sam Young's hunger strike and his final big press conference thing that he held. And we talk quite a bit about it. We go into a fairly deep dive into the historical precedent for these bishops' interviews as they're conducted, as well as a number of aspects within the Protect Elias Children movement as it has developed and how it stands today. We also hear from Sam Young in the middle of it, as well as from Nicole Jensen, who really gave us an insider's view of the Mormon sexual abuse and emotional abuse healing process, and of the groups that she works with and is affiliated with in working to help people process what has happened in their past within the Mormon context. So it was a really good episode. It was a long form deep dive, kind of like a bunch of the older episodes of Naked Mormonism, only it wasn't about Mormon history. It was about this Protect Elias Children. And just want to send you guys over to that episode if you want to check it out. It's on the Glass Box podcast feed, episode 4. With that, let's go ahead and shut it down for tonight. As always, I want to thank the patrons who support the show, and most importantly, thank you, all of you listeners, once again, for lending me your ear. Hope to talk to you next time, here on the Naked Mormonism podcast. This podcast is produced with the help of Julie Briscoe as production assistant and director of social media, and Brian Ziegenhagen as audio engineer. Music is produced by Jason Camo from aloststateofmind.com and is used with permission. Naked Mormonism is a production of Ground Gnome Studios, LLC, copyright 2018, all rights reserved.